Most of us have already had to face some kind of grief in our lives. Some of us actually probably haven't. That's actually often the case. I remember my first real sense of knowing grief was when eventually my grandparents died. I actually had the experience of going to a funeral with no grief attached because we were invited to the funeral, and I got kind of amused at this funeral because of the way things went. Discovered later it was not quite the way things normally went, and so when I came to facing the grief of losing my grandfather and my grandmother, it was kind of with mixed emotions that I faced that. They were people who were very, very dear in my life. They were people who had been beside me when things were pretty rough. I hadn't realized why my grandparents favored me at the time. It was later I realized that it's because of my circumstances of my birth and the situations that had happened. But it's strange, everybody's different with grief. I never forget walking with my brother, one of my brothers, and he was all welled up and tense. And in the end I said to him, men can cry, It's okay to cry. And he did. I don't think he would have if somebody hadn't given him permission, but you see, we handle things differently, all of us. Some of us repress stuff and some of us don't. Well, this morning what I'm wanting to do is bring us to a place where we not only handle grief well, but we actually deal with things well through life. Because it's not just about death. Grief has a lot to do with other things. Grief can do with things that we actually lose in life. Some things that may make little sense. Some things that may make huge sense. I remember one of our girls when we were young, cuddly blanket disappeared. We still don't know to this day where it disappeared to. Man, did that cause some grief for our little one. Cause some grief in our home. This is the kind of things that we don't expect to. They catch us off guard, and sometimes that's the case. So this morning, as we talk about this topic, I want us to reflect on this because I want us to see that there's actually two different worldviews around the whole thing of grief. And I want to draw some conclusions at the end that might be helpful to us in terms of our own journey. So let's have a look at it. What is the purpose of grief? Because it's a terrible thing sometimes. Does it have a purpose? So what is the purpose? Well, I want to suggest that grief is the means by which we work through loss and pain. If we didn't have that sense of grief that we work through, we'd actually be missing some aspects of human life. We'd not be able to experience true joy if we were not able to experience true grief. Because the two things are so different to each other, so opposite and yet so similar in some ways. And there is a process. It's not bad. So if you go through sense of grief over anything, one of the things I want to say this morning, it's okay to actually grieve. This morning we've got some people in our congregation, more than one family, there's actually, I think, 3 families that I'm aware of, and there may even be more, who've lost family members just in the last week. And we sit with each other, and we can weep with each other, and we can put our arms around each other. I want to say to those who've lost people that we are very much with you. Some of us have been praying for you. So we work through these things, and it's not bad. So I want to look at a definition of grief, just so that everybody's clear in their mind as to what it actually is. It's an intense, deep, and profound sorrow caused by a specific event or situation. It's got this depth in it. Sorrow doesn't have to be bad. It can be very loving sorrow. I thought the guys did an incredible good job finding that video that we saw. Well, actually, both of them were really good, but the first one really got me. No words, just a life lived on screen. Very, very powerful. Because that's the reality for all of us. We don't want it to happen, but eventually it does. So in terms of that, why don't you just get over it? I've actually heard people say that to other people. Why don't you just get over it? You know, time's passed. It's been 2 years now and you haven't got past it. Well, for some people, it's not that easy. It's not that easy at all. See, the reality is that grief is, first of all, complex. Secondly, grief is never the same. You actually may have totally different forms of grief over exactly the identical situations in your life. Different forms of grief. Thirdly, it is destructive if you try burying it. There may be people in this room who've thought, well, as a Christian, I can't go around having grief. I've got to suppress it. Or for some other reason, you know, because the family said you shouldn't cry or whatever it is. Some people try to bury grief. The thing about grief is even if you bury it, it pops up all the time. It's kind of like pressure under the surface. It sits there. And if you try burying it, you'll never deal with it. And it'll create other problems in your life. So it's destructive to you if you bury it. Next. What happened there? Oops, I lost one. Never mind. Grief in terms of its destructive nature. It can be destructive in some ways that we don't expect. See, rushing through grief or pushing grief through grieving leads to wrong thinking, despair, and often a very disruptive life. Some people think, you know, I can grieve for a week and then it's going to be all over. I'm just going to shut off. That's actually burying it. So we ought to cover that aspect of it because some people think there's time limits to this whole deal. I want to come to some really positive news a little later. So just for those of you who might be feeling down in the mouth about this at the moment, okay? Deep grief can be unrecognized, can involve depression, and can be expressed in silent or visible anger. Some of you, if you look back in your life, you will realize that you suddenly became angry and you didn't know why. Often that's happened through grief. It can happen because you lost your job. And so from that day onwards, and I know of situations like this where I've had to counsel people who've lost their job, and when they do eventually get a new job, because the boss treated them badly in the previous job, they don't trust this new boss. And so their grief controls the way that they respond to other people, and they have a silent anger. It will not serve you well. It will not protect you, because that's actually what it's about. It's a mechanism that we try to use to protect ourselves. Anger's one of them. One of the things that's there. Sometimes people face some kind of depression because of grief. Their personality ceases to be bubbly, or they find themselves feeling overwhelmed constantly. All sorts of different reactions that go with depression. I just want to say to you that if that's the case for you, I'd really recommend you come and get some help, because you may need that. The truth of the matter is, your life may not be the same simply because something has been unresolved in terms of grief. So, in terms of its destructive nature, what does a person get for all the toil, says Ecclesiastes, and anxious striving with which they labour under the sun? All their days their work is pain and grief. Even at night their mind does not rest. This too is meaningless. I want to suggest Ecclesiastes is right, but there's a point it picks up on that I think we need to think about. We can allow life to be a pain. We can allow work to be a pain. We can allow things that happen to us to be a pain and to control us. But if that's the case, then it's true what Ecclesiastes says. It's just meaningless. We need to live better than that. And we need to live a way above that. So, when does grief happen? When does it happen? Here's just some general thoughts, but it'll cover most things for most of our lives. When we have the loss of someone you love, that's an obvious one. Secondly, a connection with somebody. I remember when I moved from Cheviot, where I started school. I was only about 7 years old, going towards 8 years old when we moved. My friend next door, his name was Ricky. I really, really grieved over him. I grieved over losing my friendship so badly. And starting in a school partway through the year didn't help. Because I didn't have the friends because everybody had already formed their friendships in the classroom. It just wasn't easy. It just wasn't helpful. And it was recognised I was really struggling with this, so my parents arranged for me to go back to Cheviot and spend some time with my friend Ricky. The trouble was, with the best of intentions, it made it worse. It didn't make it better at all. I felt the loss so strongly because while I was there, Ricky's brother actually came and stayed home from work. He was at working age, and he was quite a lot older than Ricky. And he made this 6-foot kite, and we went flying kites, open paddocks, and where we'd moved to, there were no open paddocks, and flying kites was dangerous because there were power lines everywhere. That kind of thing just compounded stuff for me. So the connection with somebody a loss of connection. Physical function or looks. If we have already looked all right, I found something on the internet this morning. I stumbled on it. This young girl, some of you may have seen her. She's just been involved in 2017 in one of those international singing competition things. At 18 years old, she went totally deaf. She still sings. The way that she can sing is that her memory of the songs means she sings in tune, but she can't hear the music, but she can feel it, so they have the bass lines and things loud, and she sings. Amazing story around this young woman. Incredible grief she talks about. Incredible grief over the loss of her ability to hear. 18 years old, and she was in the music school at the time. So that really compounded her grief even more, because that was going to be her life. And here she is now, singing on stage without being able to hear herself, only being able to feel the notes in her body. Somehow, she's worked through it. So she had a lost physical function. It might be a loss of looks. I remember after I had shingles on the right side of my face, I ended up with this, some of you will remember, this big purple scar on my face. I was told it was never going to go away. And I actually went through a stage where people in the congregation were finding it very, very hard to look at me. A number of people were. Very difficult. Some even voiced it, that it was very difficult for them to have a pastor with a face like my face was. I was wondering whether I was going to have to walk away from pastorate because people were not coping. There's a lot of grief going on inside me at that point. Fortunately, we went down to the Christian Dance Fellowship New Zealand conference, and afterwards, Pauline and I went and visited an old friend who had helped us when we were in Oamaru as youth pastors and small group pastors. And he had married a doctor, and she looked at my face and she said, "Anybody giving you stuff for that mark on your face?" I said, "No, they told me it can't be removed. I just have to live with it." And she got really angry. She said, "I just get so fed up," and she's mad as. And she ordered this cream called Horodoid cream, and in 3 days it started disappearing. She said, "I've written articles on this, and doctors all over the country are ignoring it." And people are living with facial scars they don't need to carry. It was a huge relief, I can tell you. Looks and physical function can really bring good grief. Work, loss of work. Some of you have faced that in this building here. That can be really painful. I've never had that experience. And it must be so hard. Because I've watched what happens. Loss of opportunity that was set before you. You know, it can happen, the opportunity to be married, and then somebody changes their mind and they don't come to the altar. Now, we sang that song, Come to the Altar, this morning, and I was very aware of my message, and I was thinking of the wrong altar. You know? But lots of opportunity, even some people. I have a friend who really felt God was calling him to become a pastor. We're good friends. He really felt strongly God was calling him to become a pastor. But his wife refused. After they got married, she said, I don't ever want to be a pastor's wife. He's still grieving over that. He still has not been able to get past it because she has been unrelenting in her opposition to that idea. It's been difficult for him. And lastly, vision. When we lose vision, and we lose the ability to carry that vision because of some circumstance in our life that was unexpected, that we didn't know about, that we didn't know circumstances were going to change. The things we might have had that we can't have, whatever it was, that can cause grief for people. Okay, the absence of God in the secular world brings a lack of understanding of grief as well. So if you're not a follower of Jesus, I believe this categorically. I've had some really interesting discussions over this topic. The secular world comes up with these answers about grief that are not actually realistic and about dealing with grief. One of the interesting stories, for example, is the story of Sigmund Freud, or Freud as some people call him. You know, he had a theory. Let me put it up. Secular experiences with grief indicate the dilemmas created by faulty belief systems. And I believe the secular worldview is a very faulty belief system which precipitates some other faulty beliefs. So for example, in this case, Freud had a fixation of cutting ties with the dead. He believed that when somebody died, you had to cut ties somehow, and they go through this counselling process. By the way, people who don't know who this person is, he was a very world-famous psychologist, psychoanalyst, or something. I can't remember the exact title he had in that stream of thinking. And he had this fixation about cutting ties with the dead. But his idea was rooted very strongly in atheism. Atheism believes there's no God, and so there's a detachment from reality and all sorts of stuff that goes with that for many people who have an atheistic belief. That obsessive atheism demands that one reject the possibility of reunion and realize that the loved one is no more. So what they're saying, when somebody dies, there's no way you can hold on to that loved one. It demands you've got to say, this is reality, get over it. That's basically what it comes down to. You put it in rather crude terms. The difficulty that he had, and this is the real difficulty, was that he never got beyond the loss of his 27-year-old daughter, Sophie, and later of Sophie's 4-year-old son, who both died. He never actually got over it. He was traumatized for his whole life. This is a problem you have when you have a belief system which actually doesn't know how to cope with grief well. And, you know, I believe categorically, when you take God out of the mix, you really are creating a problem. And there's reasons for that. I want to look now, and we'll come back to the God factor thing shortly. The findings of clinical psychologists, they do help us to understand several things. And this is both Christian and those who are not followers of Christ have come to some agreement, to some degree. All their lists vary slightly, but essentially they're the same. Okay? First of all, if we look at the different responses, which we'll talk about shortly, first of all, my reactions are normal and predictable. So when I face grief, there's certain things that are likely to happen to me. Secondly, I was not losing my mind, but experiencing what the vast majority of bereaved parents experience. This is there's a guy I'm going to put up on the screen in a moment, Harold, who talked about this in his own way and understanding this. Feeling numb and short of breath is a normal experience for many people facing grief. Thinking incoherent thoughts is quite normal. You will notice when people are facing extreme grief that they won't talk or think logically sometimes. Looking around and expecting my son to run in at any moment is not a sign of mental illness. Our cat got pretty sick recently and we had to get her put down. She just wasn't doing well. And one of the things that Pauline has talked about is she half expects when she gets up in the morning, some mornings, to open the door and the cat's there. Because the cat's not there anymore. And that's what happens. Seriously questioning the nature of God is not unusual for people of faith at times of grief. It's not always the case with every person, but there are times when people do seriously question the nature of God. Not necessarily the existence of God, the nature of God, His loving nature, His caring nature. Why did you let this happen, God, is often a question people have when they're facing grief. My emotional and physiological responses were quite predictable, is what Harold says. These are things he found, and he did a lot of research on this whole topic, and that's why he talks about it so clearly. Now, I want to say something to those of you who are dealing with people who are facing grief. Never, ever, even if you've had similar situation, never, ever say these words. I know what you're going through, because you don't. You might think you do. You might even identify very strongly with what the other person's going through. But every one of our responses as individuals is totally different. So you can't possibly know what the other person's going through. Only God knows that. You might have some idea, you might be able to, because of that, bring some empathy, but don't say that. When somebody said that to me once, they actually had no idea what I was going through. They were totally convinced I felt absolutely terrible and all the rest of it when I was laying in hospital having been bashed quite badly. And they said this to me, I actually wasn't going through what they thought. My grief was slightly different. My only grief was my concern that I'd been told I was going to die. And my first thought was, what about Pauline and the kids, Lord? That was my little moment of grief. And then I remembered the promises that God had given me, and so that cut it short pretty fast. And that's the way we can respond very differently. So let's look at understanding grief stages. The first thing is, I've somehow messed this up. Okay. That line shouldn't be up, the earlier line shouldn't be up there, okay? Confusion and disorientation often has the first thing people have as a response. Our self-perception and worth are affected. I was unable to read well or drive a car reliably for several weeks, said one person. And I've heard people say that to me as well. Sorry, now we got it right. Denial. This is a shock reaction. It can't be true. Not me. We refuse to believe what actually happened. I'm going to wake up out of a dream in a moment is a thought I had on one occasion. But I woke up and it wasn't a dream, it was real. So we often go through denial process when there's bad things happen. I've really messed this up this time, haven't I? I don't normally do that. Okay. We can be irrational and worried about unimportant things and and real issues around the future of coping. We can be anxious about all sorts of things. The next heading, anger. Resentment grows. Why me? Why my child? This isn't fair. Why did I lose my job? All those things. Some direct blame toward God and others often, and ourselves. We feel agitated, irritated, moody, and on edge. And sometimes that can go on for a long, long time. I believe there are people in this congregation, because I've seen it, who have made decisions and then regretted those decisions very, very badly. And they've been going through grief and they haven't recognized that's actually what's happening. One or two of you I've tried to talk with. Sometimes you want to know, sometimes you don't. That's your business, that's okay. But the reality is that anger can sit there. And I believe, and listen to this carefully, I believe once that anger starts, unless it's dealt with properly, it will not go away. And so some of the anger any of you might be feeling may be sourced in grief from a long time ago. And it would be good to deal with it if it is. It would be really helpful. Okay, see if I got this one right. Guilt. Nearly all survivors suffer guilt when there's a grief situation. People who've been in plane crashes who survive feel guilty that they survived and other people on the plane next to them didn't. It's one of the big experiences that people have. Most without real cause. Even those with good reason to feel guilty must work through these feelings so that they can move forward. So, I don't know how Pauline's sister's friends who took her out boating felt afterwards, after a long time, but I know at least one of them initially felt absolutely terrible that they'd taken her in the boat. The boat broke down in the middle of a very swift flowing river in the river down south, which is the name's eluding me. The Waimakariri River, my wife whispered. And the awful feeling they had afterwards, that they'd had a boat that had proven to be unreliable right in the middle of rapids. As a consequence, Jenny died. Yeah, you can blame yourself, but you've actually got to get past that. You've got to work through that stuff. Guilt is destructive, never helpful. It's never helpful to carry guilt around. So we need to understand that. Depression. Now we say, yes, me. The courage to admit our loss brings sadness, which can be healthy, mourning and grieving, and or hopelessness, which is unhealthy, mourning and grieving. In other words, sometimes we take ownership and we allow things to control us in a way that we might not have expected. Healthy mourning and grieving is actually really important, but it can become unhealthy, basically. Admitting I need help is imperative right at this time. If you're facing some kind of depressive nature or aspect in your life, getting help right then is actually really important. So let's have a look. At this point we come to this thing called bargaining. In terms of bargaining, we try to make a deal often with God, insisting that things be the way they used to be. God, if you heal my little girl, then I'll never drink again. Or we call a temporary truce with God and say, okay, God, I'm sort of sorry for now. A lot of people who don't know God actually will do this. A number of people over the years have said, I must admit I called out to God once, and I always ask them this question afterwards: what did you do about what you promised him? Because it almost always is a promise. Excuse me, still recovering from that coffee thing. By the way, somebody told me that a few weeks ago they thought this was beer. It's ginger beer. It's non-alcoholic, all right? Right. Just in case I was causing you grief, I thought I would explain. Okay. So, this whole bargaining thing is something that some Christians do quite strongly because they think they have this relationship with God that's going to exclude them from suffering, pain and suffering. But the truth of the matter is it's not going to. Then the last stage. This is a stage that some people never reach and need to reach. It's a whole thing of acceptance. Now we face our loss calmly. It is a time of silent reflection and regrouping. Life has to go on. But how? It's actually a carrot that leads us on the race with reality. If we can get to acceptance, then it means peace and health can be there. It's kind of like a carrot to get us there in some ways. What do I do now? We have to ask that question. And when we start asking that question, it's actually really helpful to us to ask the question. So I now want to talk about good grief. I want to talk about this from a very different angle. There's a little book written by a guy called Granger, who for many years I've actually found quite helpful to giving to people facing grief. It's a very skinny little thing. But I think there's such a thing as good grief. Remember Charlie Brown? He'd always say good grief. But it's not quite what he meant. Is there such a thing as good grief? There is such a thing as good grief. And I want to suggest there's ways we can actually capture and discover what good grief is really about. We can experience it. If we look at it like this, we all wish we could skip right to acceptance and miss all the other stages out. But it's the lessons learned in other stages of our grief that make acceptance possible. Don't rush the process. Be patient. So if you're facing grief, don't sort of, I got to fix this, If you've got to fix it, or if you've got to fix your marriage partner when they're going through grief, you're going to create a problem. You're not going to help yourself or the other person. There's a process. And in actual fact, if you go through the process well, you'll end up doing well. Grief is complex and varied, which I've already said. But it touches us all. We must all learn about its basics so we can better help ourselves or others. And in terms of those basics, can I give you some thoughts this morning? When we get into denial, which is one of the stages, as I said earlier, the best thing we can do is actually do what many characters in Scripture did, is be honest with yourself and be honest with God about how you're feeling. It's a different response to the secular world. It's a Christian response. When you get to anger and resentment, God doesn't mind you complaining as long as you're willing to hear His answers. God doesn't mind you complaining. And when it comes to bargaining, don't try to bargain in the way that the secular world does. You just say, God, I'm giving myself to you. This is my response I'm going to do. So you don't have to buy into the whole bargaining to try and do a deal with God. Just give yourself to God. It's a very different response. And when you come to feeling any depression or maybe even alienation, one of the things you would be well to do is to actually ask God for help in terms of this whole thing. Actually expect to receive God's help because He's often willing to be there. A trusting faith, a real sense in the Scripture and the Psalms, you find this particularly a groaning to God for help, but also groaning with hope at the same time. When you look at things, look at God's grace in the situation you had. It's not about what you don't have anymore. It's about what you did have, and be grateful for that. That's actually a helpful part of the process for us to go through in grieving. It won't come easily sometimes. And when you come to that acceptance thing, one of the things I think would be really helpful for most of us is to take what you have learned out of the journey and share it with others, and actually take God's hope and love with you, because you'll actually help others to live a different life. In 1 Peter, we find a passage of Scripture. As soon as I find it, I lost it for a second. In 2 Peter 1:3. His divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of Him who called us by His own glory and goodness. So it gives us the ability to even cope with extreme grief. God wants us to understand that. So once we become totally conscious and aware of what our grief does and doesn't do for us, then we're able to make some decisions about how we want to live. Until we come to that place, we can't go forward. And so if you see people going through grief, one of the things you can do is help them to realize that. I've just got some scriptures to finish with. The first one is this. In Psalm 56 verse 8 says, "You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Have you not recorded them?" as NIV translates it. I purposely didn't use NIV here because I've taken the concept about your tears in a bottle and tried to change it to try and say something else. But nobody fully understands what the Hebrew word means at this point. But you put your my tears in your bottle. God's kept account of things. He has a record of everything that happens to us. And he's there with us. And we need to be aware that he really does feel our pain with us. I'll never forget the shortest verse of the Bible because it was so easy for me to remember. Because I was used to some memory verses when I was young. But this one I remembered. Jesus wept. He felt grief. Okay to weep. Next one. 1 Peter says this, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you." So don't cut yourself off from God when you need him most. Let him get closer to you. Let him be your comfort. Let him be there beside you. Next. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. The hope means that we don't need to feel a total loss about everything. We do have that hope. It's an anchor for our soul. It keeps us there. Remember the song the guys sang here earlier on the stage? I think they did a great job too, by the way. Let's give them another big hand. The whole team. "I will rise again," says the determined words of the song. "I can go higher. I'm taller and stronger." And when we grieve, well, those words are so true. Those words are so true. So I finish with this last scripture. And this is a little bit of an unusual one, but it's one for our future. It's one we need to think about in our future. I'll never forget this guy who's on the screen. Can't remember his surname, but it's Tony. What's his name? Evans, that's right, thank you. Tony Evans. I remember ringing out with these words. "I tell you the truth, you'll weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." Now, this is when the disciples were grieving because Jesus was that was it, finish. That was the way they viewed it. And he gives them these words of comfort. No matter what happens in life, in the future, we will have this incredible sense of joy. That can not only in the future, long way down there, but even right now, because the disciples, in a very short time after Jesus said these words, discovered how powerful that was. And it's something that can happen for every single one of us in this room. And no matter what we face, there is still that hope that's an anchor for our soul. There is still that expectation that God is with us. So when we lose things, rather than allowing those things to control our lives entirely, fine, we've got to go through the grief process. It's helpful for us to do so. But don't make that the hinge point of the rest of your life experience. In other words, if you lose your job, don't say, "Well, I'm useless because I lost my job." Say, "No, God has something else for me, and I'm fully expecting that he will do something to take me to the future." When I lose somebody who's close to me in my family, it's not so much the loss. I love the emphasis in the second video we had this morning. You know, I would far rather have had that person in my life for 21 years, she says. The mum says. Was it mum, I think? Says, than never to have had him before. That's a really healthy perspective. To have something that you would rather have that than nothing. And I think my expectation for the future is that God is going to be with us. I know one day that we're going to come to a place that Paulie and I are going to get too old to just continue doing some things. There'll be a grieving process in that. But I should live in hope and expectation of what God's going to do in the future. Amen? So it doesn't matter what stage we are in life. Then we can be grateful. I will never forget a family that was in our church. They live in Auckland now, Craig and Gail Russell. They had a little baby. It was twins, wasn't it? They had, and one had it looked like a cycloptic eye. It's actually two eyes merged into one. And it was not a great look. But I remember something that they did, which was something I don't think most people did in those situations. The hospitals were certainly surprised and really encouraged them in what they were doing. They were taking photos, and they were with the little one in the short life that they had, because I only lived a very, very short time. Some of our congregation didn't cope too well. It was hard. But Craig and Gail made the best of the time they knew they were going to have, and they knew it was only going to be short with their little one. And they coped with that by facing it really squarely. I think their grieving process was so vividly out there and so real. And I know one or two people had to come and have a talk with me. I can't remember who it was who came and talked right now, but I just recall that there were one or two people that did talk. And Craig and Gail wanted everybody to hold their baby. And some people found it so hard because their grief for Craig and Gail was bigger than the grief in one sense. Not bigger than the grief overall, but bigger than the grief in one sense. That this little child looked like that. It was powerful moments. Powerful life. But it enabled them to move forward where I've seen others who faced things nowhere near as extreme in its tragedy on the surface of it. But it enabled them to go forward in a wonderful way at the time because Jesus was at the center of their life, and they made that the reality by living it. And if you're not a follower of Christ, if you don't have Jesus as a reality right in the middle of it, I want to suggest to you this morning that that's actually the most important thing you can do. If you are an atheist, then I recommend, I'm happy to sit down and talk with you, and I believe I can prove the living God is real. If you're having some trouble believing in what God could do, maybe you've gone through grief and it's been too hard, God is there for you. He's there for every single one of us. And He wants us to know that. He wants us to carry that. So rather than just getting irritated at God, He's quite happy to hear you complain. But He's also intent on healing your wounds. So let's talk to God about that right now. Lord, in some ways it's really hard to do justice to a complex topic like this. And yet, Lord, there's an essence of your presence here. And Lord, we want to ask, Lord, that you will be with us, you will help us, you will guide us, you will lead us. Lord, for some of us, we need healing from the past. There's been grief there that we haven't resolved. And so, Lord God, we would ask, Lord, that you move into that space and bring freedom and healing in Jesus' name. And Lord, for others of us for the future, we pray you'd give us the courage to be your people in a real way. That we'll be honest and we'll be transparent. We won't try to repress things and pretend you can just bury them. Just cut them off. It just isn't real. Lord, you are the reality. You're the power. You're the presence. And Lord, we want to say we put our hope in you and in nothing else. So we declare it in Jesus' mighty name. And they all said,